Modern history has borne witness to the dramatic global ascent of economics. Since the mid-19th century, the study of the economy has evolved from a loosely defined field with blurry boundaries into a fully professionalized enterprise. This transformation stands as a vindication of the discipline's long effort to establish a coherent and highly formalized framework. Today, the field asserts extensive practical authority across administrative systems, business structures, and mass media institutions. Perhaps more than any other form of knowledge, economics has actively participated in the rationalization of our life world, as described by Habermas. It has accomplished this by extending its logic through a zealous encroachment into even the most remote areas of our everyday experiences. At first glance, the expanding discourse and profession of economics might be interpreted as a fairly homogeneous global trend toward societal rationalization. Indeed, the dominant intellectual form within economic science, which is rooted largely in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, generally presents itself as a universal paradigm. In this rigorous environment, the economist often functions much like a secular clergyman, interpreting the complex dogmas of the market for the general public. Its primary rhetorical tool, model building, is frequently accepted without question as the natural product of the cumulative development of scientific knowledge. Through the creation of these precise structures, the field consistently attempts to live up to the high standards of objectivity associated with the hard sciences. Furthermore, since professions derive much of their authority and social legitimacy from defining a coherent domain of knowledge, we may regard modern economics' claims to an expert monopoly as a logical extension of its internal theoretical strength. The extensive jurisdictional privileges of economists thus seem legitimized by the fact that their discipline constitutes undoubtedly the most well-bounded and organized scholarly enterprise in the social scientific field. The primary objective of this article is to challenge the supposed naturalness that characterizes scientific and professional development in economics. Unlike a clergyman preaching from a universal text, economists do not always adhere to a single, shared doctrine across the globe. Cross-national surveys have already indicated that economists in different countries possess varying convictions about the economic world and the potential effects of specific policies. These experts also perceive their missions through different lenses, viewing their work as primarily academic in the United States or more political in Europe. Furthermore, available historical studies regarding national economic fields suggest highly diverse pathways for professionalization and disciplinary development. It is evident that unique national identities never simply gave in to a homogenized global standard. Overall, this contradicts the frequent assumption that economics is a constant and universally shared science. Instead, there appears to be considerable cross-national variation in the timing and nature of how economic knowledge is institutionalized. Significant differences are also found in the forms of professional action taken by economists. Finally, the discipline is shaped by distinct intellectual traditions that vary from one nation to another. However, the question of how to explain such differences, along with the ways these variations relate to one another, remains largely unexplored. In particular, we lack a satisfactory theory of knowledge formation that can simultaneously account for the intrinsic nature of ideas and the decisive social structures that support them. Furthermore, our comparative frameworks are often designed to contrast broad cultural groups, such as the continental versus the Anglo-Saxon worlds. Because these models appear insufficient to capture the subtle cross-national variations within those categories, such overly generalized approaches may well be on the way out. I will now turn my attention to each of these puzzles separately. This article begins with the methodological premise that knowledge is never truly aloof from the social structures in which it is embedded. To understand the relationship between the institutional and intellectual aspects of knowledge production, one must first conduct a historical analysis of the conditions that allowed a coherent domain of discourse to be established. This consideration has prompted a specific focus on the institutionalization of economics at the turn of the 20th century. The years roughly spanning from the 1880s to the 1910s represent a critical period in the formation of the social sciences and constitute a unique site to investigate this emerging regime. Indeed, it was during this transformative era that economics started to crystallize as a distinct occupational practice. This shift was characterized by the emergence of university chairs, scholarly reviews, and professional organizations, as well as a growing demand for economic expertise from various sectors of society.
Through a detailed historical analysis of four national cases, Germany, Great Britain, France, and the United States, I demonstrate that the institutional location of economists is always of paramount importance to understanding the intellectual substance of the knowledge they produce. In other words, the twin questions of who qualifies as an economist and what constitutes valid economic knowledge are far more deeply intertwined than most professional brethren in the field usually acknowledge.
We cannot, for instance, consider the emergence of historical economics in Germany and analytical economics in Great Britain as the result of pure historical contingencies. These divergences were not merely random accidents or symptoms of intellectual decadence, but rather the inevitable outcomes of their respective environments. Rather, we must relate both intellectual forms to specific political and educational institutions. I argue that these broader structures have shaped the intellectual location of economics by making certain cognitive frames available while effectively excluding others. Furthermore, by locating the formation of economic knowledge within particular academic contexts, these institutions constrained the range of possible academic alliances. My goal is not to adopt a purely relativistic stance on the production of knowledge, nor to argue that scientific discourse is derived solely from institutional factors. However, claiming that these elements do not matter at all would be an equally unfortunate mistake. It seems intuitively valid that paradigms are partly conceived on a national level, connecting them to broader cultural characteristics and organizational arrangements. For instance, Galting identifies distinct national intellectual styles, which he connects to characteristics found in the social structure. In his study of railroad development across 3 countries, Dobbin suggests that rationality itself is actually a cultural product. He argues that political culture shapes not only the institutional instruments available to actors for conducting industrial policy, but also their perception of the problems at hand. To truly grasp the nuance of these constraints, we must perform a theoretical decomposition of the complex layers separating policy from culture. The solutions proposed to handle these problems are ultimately the result of this dual constraint.
This article emphasizes a similar point by showing that scientific discourses in economics are inevitably driven by broader, nationally constituted cultural frameworks embodied in specific institutions of knowledge production. Turning now to the comparative aspect of the argument, this article demonstrates how national political structures and institutions have shaped the development of economic knowledge in the 4 countries under investigation. As the propounders of this emerging discipline in Germany, Great Britain, France, and the United States struggled to gain legitimacy, they sought to construct their role relative to other professional enterprises. To achieve this standing, these practitioners endeavored to derive authority from 3 central institutions: the higher education system, the state, and the economy. Specifically, they formulated claims regarding the intellectual distinctiveness of their field and its usefulness for practical occupations. Furthermore, they underscored the vital relevance of economic knowledge for guiding policy decisions and navigating complex social experiments. However, the nature of the economists' involvement with these institutions, as well as their ability to successfully mobilize them in the pursuit of legitimacy, was highly uneven across different national contexts. In reality, distinct institutional environments in each country provided unique sources of authority upon which to base jurisdictional claims. This variation ultimately endowed every national field with its own specific identity. In Germany, for example, the professional authority and content of economics were profoundly influenced by the formal relationship between the Mandarin class of professors and the state. Their intimate connection to administrative practice allowed them to occupy a semi-neutral position that bridged the gap between academic theory and governmental authority.
On the other hand, the United Kingdom exhibited a significantly more decentralized model. In this context, economic practitioners asserted their position through civil society institutions by relying on strictly scientific claims and the socialese associated with their high-minded status. By comparison, the institutional standing and intellectual authority of economics in France faced the most significant challenges among the 4 countries studied. This vulnerability was largely driven by a lack of state support and a frailty in organization that threatened a structural decomposition of the discipline itself. In contrast, the professional identity of American economists at the turn of the century was fundamentally shaped by their capacity to prove the utility and relevance of their insights to powerful institutional crowds.
Much like gracious hostesses ensuring every guest feels attended to, these scholars had to carefully tailor their intellectual offerings to satisfy the specific demands of their key audiences. Consequently, this research seeks to establish medium-range analytical categories that assist us in contextualizing the intricate relationship between societal institutions and the production of knowledge. In other words, the goal is to pinpoint the essential factors that allowed for the formulation of jurisdictional claims regarding the economy across these four distinct national contexts. Consequently, this work falls within the expanding realm of comparative historical literature. These studies illustrate how state structures and broad institutional arrangements have sculpted the academic and professional landscape of the social sciences alongside their engagement with public policy. Furthermore, the text addresses a crucial finding in the modern sociology of professions regarding the fundamental divergence between two developmental paths.
One path is the continental European model, which centers on the state as a primary regulator and often mirrors the centralized authority historically held by the aristocracy. In contrast, the Anglo-Saxon or liberal model is defined by decentralized control managed by practitioners who have gathered in independent associations. However, the four-way comparison utilized in this article facilitates a much more precise analysis of the role political institutions play in shaping professional and intellectual jurisdictions. By acknowledging variations within the two major categories, this perspective ensures that distinct national identities are not uprooted by broad generalizations. For instance, the analysis illuminates the specific differences between French and German continentalism, as well as the divergence between American and British liberalism. For instance, it would be a historical travesty to ignore the fact that the relationship of French economists to the state was heavily conflict-ridden during much of the 19th century and well into the 20th. By stark contrast, German economics was much better articulated and integrated within administrative institutions. Correspondingly, the American form of professionalism was organized quite differently from the British model. The American system featured significantly less centralization around authority figures, texts, and institutions. As we describe below, these four distinct relationships ultimately gave rise to four different professions. Regarding the rise of the field at the end of the 19th century, economic discourse was certainly not born in that specific era. However, the roots of modern economic analysis are usually traced to the period following the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith in 1776. While many scholars followed in his footsteps, few were regarded as his equals during the foundational years of the discipline.
Dumont argues that the major conceptual breakthrough of the great Scotsman's book resides in the separation of the economic realm from the political realm. He highlights the constitution of the former as an autonomous intellectual category, distinguishing it from the broader moral philosophies often debated by groups such as the Freemasons. As such, this pivot inaugurated an era where the practice of political economy would assert itself as an increasingly distinct and separate enterprise. Between the 1790s and the marginalist revolution of the 1870s, formal economic theory was still largely in its infancy. Nonetheless, a specialized field of discourse was progressively circumscribed for the study of the economy during the specific period. There is little doubt that the transformation of European economies and societies by the Industrial Revolution played an important role in the rise of these new forms of knowledge. Ultimately, these societal shifts prompted a deep interest in the economic mechanisms which were thought to accompany the process of change. For instance, the assumption that the rise of modern economic thought was sparked by shifting economic relations is implicit in Heilbronner's classic book, The Worldly Philosophers. This perspective is similarly reflected in Polanyi's The Great Transformation, which links the victory of laissez-faire ideologies to the self-regulating market forces unleashed after the repeal of the Speen-Hamlin system in early 19th century Britain. However, one must maintain serious reservations regarding the view that economics as a field is simply a byproduct of the emergence of industrial society, as this perspective fails to honor the complexity of historical processes. Primarily, historiography has branched out to reveal that other significant factors played a vital role in the institutionalization of economic discourse. For instance, in Germany, the expansion of public finances and state bureaucracies played a pivotal role in this development. Similarly, a close study of the American context reveals that the rise of the social sciences was intimately tied to the emergence of a new institutional form known as the modern research university. Secondly, relying solely on the timing of industrialization offers an impoverished explanation for the pattern of institutionalizing economics as a field of teaching and practice. Furthermore, such a timeline fails to account for the discipline's analytical progress. Thus, we must look to England and France, two countries that witnessed the most profound intellectual achievements during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. While Schumpeter held these intellectual strides in high regard, the formal organization of economic teaching in these nations actually arrived late and proceeded rather slowly. By contrast, in the later developing German states, early forms of what we now distinguish as economics existed as fairly self-conscious and institutionally organized subjects, often serving the interests of powerful aristocracies, most notably in Prussia. Yet, we are less often aware of this reality because German economics, being far less analytical than its British counterpart, did not yield a similar theoretical system, leaving the discipline's history to appear incomplete and largely forgotten today. No single factor, therefore, appears sufficient to account for the rise of economics as an organized field of knowledge production in late 19th century Europe and America. In each country, the transformation of higher education, political structures, and economic systems shaped the national possibilities for the expansion of economic discourse and practice. Furthermore, these systemic changes oriented the local fields of economic knowledge production along very distinctive development paths.
I next examine each case separately. In Germany, the evolving role of the state was deeply intertwined with the undisputed authority of academic professors. As early as 1727, two official chairs in Ökonomie, Polizei, und Kammersachen were established at the universities of Halle and Frankfurt an der Oder. Unlike the vague mysticism peddled by bogus spiritualists of the time, these institutions focused on rigorous, practical instruction. By the end of the 18th century, nearly every university in Germany had successfully installed a chair in economics. Academic institutionalization proceeded rapidly during the 19th century. This progress included a significant expansion in the number of chairs and the development of uniform curricula. Faculties adopted clear-cut denominations for the various subjects, leading to the emergence of standardized textbooks. The discipline was further bolstered by specialized journals, comprehensive reviews, and the establishment of research seminars centered around applied questions. Finally, the field achieved full maturity with the creation of professional organizations. The German states held a pioneering position regarding systematic advanced training in economics as well as other sciences. Consequently, this reputation for academic excellence attracted a great number of foreign students to the region. A whole generation of American scholars was educated there during the 19th century. These academics were baptized in the waters of rigorous study and imbued with the principles of the German model, which they utilized to develop their own curriculums upon returning to the United States. Although the overwhelming authority of the British tradition makes it seem surprising to many of us today, the historical reality is quite different.
In fact, distinct from their British contemporaries, German economists exerted a powerful influence on the development of the discipline on an international scale up until the 1920s. This specific school of thought encompassed concepts such as Kameralism, Nationalökonomie, and Volkswirtschaftslehre. The first German economics chairs were strategically located within the faculties of philosophy. This arrangement meant that the field was originally studied in direct relation to politics and ethics. These educational programs were initiated specifically for the training of civil servants, thereby forging a close association with the business of state administration. At the time, this field was known as Cameralist science, and it was hailed as an essentially practical discipline that specialized in the purely descriptive presentation of facts relevant to public administration. Reflecting this pragmatic approach, the professors in this field were frequently involved in the actual affairs of the government. Its primary objectives were to advance the interests of the state through rational strategies, notably by focusing on the crucial question of how to raise revenues. During the 19th century, Cameralism evolved into the broader framework known as Staatswissenschaften, or the sciences of the state. This expansive field eventually encompassed economics, finance, statistics, and the sciences of trades such as agriculture, forestry, transportation, and police science. Political economy courses and textbooks were historically structured into three distinct sections: theory, policy, and public finance.
Remarkably, this organizational pattern remains largely unchanged to this day. The primary function of the Staatswissenschaften was to participate in the professional training of government officials and civil servants.
Completing this curriculum served as one of the essential academic rites of passage for these aspiring administrators, whose education was otherwise rooted primarily in the law. Thus, despite the institutional segregation that formally divided the sciences of the state from the juridical disciplines, the two fields remained intimately linked. This close relationship was sustained by their shared objective of preparing candidates for rigorous civil service examinations. Throughout the 19th century, this connection was further solidified as various German states chose to follow the Prussian example. Consequently, they increasingly placed the Staatswissenschaften under the institutional authority of state law, a discipline that had come to be regarded as a superior and more rigorous field of study. Although the Staatswissenschaften ceded some influence over civil servant training to law faculties, they were able to reconcile this shift with their continued prestige, as their academic position remained robust and their intellectual autonomy actually increased. The landscape of higher education was fundamentally redefined by the creation of the modern research university in Berlin in 1810. In this new academic model, the traditional priority of religious and humanistic instruction was effectively dispensed with in favor of scholarly specialization. This intense focus was embodied in the rigorous requirement of two separate dissertations, the doctorate and the habilitation, for anyone seeking a professorship. Furthermore, the attribution of academic chairs was strictly aligned with narrow fields of concentration rather than broad generalities. By the 1880s, this distinct academic identity was confirmed when most German universities established separate doctorates in the sciences of the state. The specialization of scholarly competence was further encouraged by the institution of the political economy seminar.
These seminars gathered the most advanced and promising students outside the framework of regular classes, fostering a dedicated environment for high-level research. On the other hand, political economists began to interpret their subject through an increasingly individualistic lens. They envisioned the state's role not as one of authoritative governance, but rather as a force to shape the economic order wherein free citizens could interact. This shift in perspective was largely a response to the impending modernization of the social structure. Consequently, specific terms like Volkswirtschaftslehre or Nationalökonomie began to replace Staatswirtschaftslehre, serving as the common designations for a field with boundaries that were becoming clearly defined. However, the complete abandonment of state-centric thought would have been treated like an alien religion within this intellectual culture, so the transition was nuanced. Within the context of German historicism, the substantive interests of these economists were undoubtedly molded by their specific institutional location. They remained deeply influenced by the broad organizational framework of the sciences of the state and their original subordination to administrative demands. To this day, the substance of German economic discourse remains characterized by a distinct focus on applied questions and social policy issues. Above all, it retains a strong emphasis on the state as a central actor within the economy. Hennings presented the situation in stark terms. He argued that economics did not evolve merely as a science for observing and explaining economic shifts, but rather as a discipline focused on how the upper strata of the state could actively influence those fluctuations. Another defining intellectual feature of German economics after 1850 was the rise of the historicist approach.
This perspective represented a significant divergence from the intellectual trajectory established by classical British political economy. While the movement was initiated in the 1840s, when its principles were spelt out by Roscher, it possessed profound roots in the philosophy of German idealism. Eventually, this historicist conception came to dominate the majority of Germany's scholarly production in the field. To put it briefly, its core methodological credo defended the unity of the human sciences, or Geisteswissenschaften, against the methods of the natural sciences. Recognizing that the abstract methods of the natural sciences were inadequate models for studying the human world, this movement proclaimed the primacy of historical monographs and empirical work over positivist methods. It insisted that complex human phenomena could not be neatly categorized, but rather must be examined within their broader, time-bound societal context. The enduring influence of this perspective is evident in Roscher's own textbook, which underwent 26 editions between 1854 and 1922.
By the 1890s, historicism had firmly established itself as the dominant theoretical position taught at universities throughout the country. This framework stood in sharp contrast to the marginalist approach defended by British and Austrian thinkers, creating a theoretical divide so deep that the opposing sides often resembled inimical religions. While marginalists believed the goal of political economy was to search for universal natural laws, historicist scholars viewed the formulation of such broad generalizations with extreme suspicion. Such fundamental rifts between inductivism and deductivism ignited critical disputes within the field toward the end of the 19th century. The most prominent of these conflicts, the Methadone Strike, famously plagued the German-speaking academic landscape from the 1880s until the 1910s.
Part of the strength of historicism in Germany stemmed from an extraordinary association with the country's political culture. This influence was further bolstered by the underlying structure of existing academic institutions. Romantic reformers in the 1800s had crafted the modern university as a model of unified knowledge situated within a historical context. Consequently, this established framework came to dominate the sequence of organizational arrangements throughout the era. It is quite remarkable, for instance, that the intellectual standing of economics remained largely unaffected during this time. This resilience persisted even as the natural sciences reorganized into separate faculties during the middle of the 19th century. Rather than isolating itself as a purely technical discipline, Nationalökonomie remained firmly anchored within the framework of the human sciences. This distinct positioning allowed a characteristically holistic approach to economic objects to prevail until well into the 20th century. The depth and complexity of this tradition were so profound that they arguably resembled secret lore, accessible only through a broad understanding of culture and history. By contrast, the situation in England unfolded according to a different logic. There, the social sciences had come into being just as the natural sciences were ascending, placing the two disciplines on parallel intellectual planes.